Here. Thank you. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for your interest in attending this important briefing and discussion on holistic wildlife management. I want to especially thank Representative Christine Reeves and her staff for their support and assistance in bringing this briefing to all of you today. During our presentation, please feel free to post questions in the chat. We will have Q&A during the second half. Suzanne Asha Stone is Executive Director of the International Wildlife Coexistence Network, a member of the 1995-96 U.S.-Canadian Wolf Reintroduction Team. She co-founded the Wood River Wolf Project, now in its 20th year, and her peer-reviewed research has been cited by Washington's own Department of Fish and Wildlife in its wolf management plan and rulemaking. I'm also pleased to introduce our special guest. Glenn Elzinga is the owner of Alderspring Ranch in central Idaho, where he raises grass-fed organic beef on mountain rangeland shared with wolves. Using holistic grazing methods that include range riders with his herd, Glenn has not lost a single cow or calf in his over a decade, while running a profitable business, family business. So thank you, Representative Reeves, for helping put this together. And thank you to all of you for being here, and Suzanne and Glenn. So I'll step back, and Suzanne, you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Ron. We really appreciate you organizing this. And I want to say thank you to Representative Christine Reeves and her office for hosting this conversation. It's always great to talk with neighbors in other states and share what we're learning about wildlife and our best practices. I'll be sharing about maybe the first half of our time together, focusing on why wolves matter ecologically and what 20 years of field evidence from the Wood River Wolf Project tells us about how to keep wolves and working landscapes viable on the same landscape. And then I'll hand things over to Glenn from Alderspring Ranch, who will be sharing his experience as well. So really welcome questions. If you have any, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will prioritize those as soon as we get through sharing some of this information with you. And so essentially, when Ron asked us to do this, he said that there were three major kind of pillars of concern and forming this briefing policy today. And one was the ecological concerns, of course. Two was economic, and three was just the social that goes along with this, and especially with wolves. There's a lot of social tension over, as you know, having wolves on the landscape. And so I'm going to be sharing with you what we've learned here in Idaho in the Wood River Valley, which is Blaine County, and talk about what our proven field tested strategies have been over the last 20 years. We kind of learned early on by the seat of our pants. And then how that applies to Western public lands, grazing lands, and how those can apply on a much larger scale. And so I'll be talking about the type of landscape that we're working on, and you'll be able to see that it's pretty much identical to some of the landscape that you're familiar with in Washington. Looking at the practical tools, what we're using on the ground, what we found works best for us, and how we use them adaptively, and then what those outcomes are. Just looking at starting this conversation though, according to the Living Planet report and others around the world, the IUCN documenting global wildlife populations have declined by 69% since 1970, which is essentially, my lifetime. And across, that's across all mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. I bring this up not to alarm anyone, but to just frame the stakes at hand. Every wildlife policy decision made today in Washington and other Western states at the federal level, as well as at the state level, is being made against this backdrop. And we're not managing wildlife in a stable system. We're managing wildlife in a system that's losing species and losing function at a historically unprecedented rate. And that has direct implication over the conversation that we're having today. The species we still have on the landscape, including the ones sometimes cause conflict, are more ecologically valuable than they have ever been because of their part of a shrinking remnant of a functional ecosystem. And what we know about wolves to date, they've only been on the landscape for us for a few short decades, just a little bit longer in Idaho than it has been in Washington. But we know from watching and observing wolves that they are pretty good at reducing massive herds and changing them more into smaller mobile herds, so especially elk, but also deer. And with that comes a benefit of having plants that can recover more quickly. The plants then turn around and help protect other elements of biodiversity, including bringing things like songbirds and beavers back to these landscapes. And so it's all part of this infrastructure that nature has set up. And they're what ecologists call an apex predator, and they really shape these entire ecosystems in a way that ripple far beyond what the animals that they hunt. So they change by changing how these ungulates move, by eliminating the weakest among them. They're creating ripples that last over a long time. They're not only in places that are riparian areas, but stream sides, creek bottoms, and then it really unlocks this cascade. So you see the willows and aspens recovering along streams. You see beaver coming back, as I mentioned, because they have building materials now. The beaver create ponds that create habitat for fish, amphibians, and birds. The stream banks, can really stabilize them, and then you just really see how it's really all connected. And it's not limited to national parks. This version of this pattern has been observed across multiple ecosystems where apex predators have been restored. The policy point is direct, is when we make decisions about wolves, we're not making decisions just about wolves. We're making decisions about the health of streams, the recovery of vegetation, the populations of dozens of other species, and the long-term resilience of our ecosystems. The ecological value of keeping wolves on the landscape is substantial and measurable. And that value makes this coexistence question worth solving. But before I show you how we're doing prevention on the ground, I want to make sure we're all kind of looking at the same problem, because the conventional approach has a structure flaw that goes unnoticed in policy conversations often. And this graphic shows what I call the spiral of conflict. And it's a spiral because it doesn't resolve, it escalates. It starts simple enough, right? Wolves discover livestock around the landscape, depredation occurs, a lamb, a calf. The agency responds with lethal movement, and then that's where most people assume that the story ends. The problem wolf is gone, the conflict is resolved. But it doesn't. Wolves are intensely territorial animals. So when you remove a pack, you don't create a wolf-free zone, you create a vacancy. And dispersing wolves, often younger, less experienced animals from neighboring territories, move in to fill that gap. These new wolves don't have the established hunting patterns, territorial knowledge, or the learned avoidance of livestock that perhaps the previous pack may have developed over years. And so conflict repeats, and frequently it becomes worse than before. The spiral tightens, there's more depredation, more removal, more dispersers, more conflict. And research by Bradley and colleagues documented that recurring depredations were typically made by the next pack to occupy that vacant territory within 2 years. So meanwhile, the costs are mounting, the investigations, the aerial operations, compensation, all of that. In the Northern Rockies, that cycle exceeded, I think it was $1.5 million in a single year, if I remember correctly. Looking at the image to the right, the wolf is standing in a pasture. That's the reality on the ground in wolf country. The question isn't whether wolves and livestock will share the same landscape. They already do. The question is whether we manage that overlap with a strategy that actually resolves the conflict, or one that keeps feeding the spiral. So with our Wood River Wolf project that we started 20 years ago, it really breaks down at that cycle at the front end. Instead of waiting for depredation and then reacting, we prevent it from happening in place. We keep the existing pack stable and territorial, and critically experienced enough to learn where the boundaries are. That's the fundamental shift here. Stable packs are manageable packs. When you know where they den, where they travel, where their rendezvous sites are, you can route sheep bands around those areas. You can position herders and deterrents where they're the most effective, and you can stay ahead of the conflict instead of chasing it. And when you kill a pack, you lose all of that knowledge, yours and theirs, and the spiral starts again from scratch. That's what we that's what we stopped doing 20 years ago, and this is what the results look like, the way that we do. So this is one of the superheroes of our project. Then we have two, what I call consider our superheroes, the herders who work with us, and the livestock guardian dogs. The herders are the foundation of our success. They stay with the bands at night and provide that essential human presence. The dogs, though, are what allows the herders to sleep at night. They're our alarm system. They know before anyone when predators are getting too close to the sheep. The only caveat is we have to address this the safety of the dogs. And most of the year, we'll avoid the 4 to 5 dogs working together per band and leave the sheep alone. However, the trouble can come in the spring when wolves are denning. Wolves are fiercely loyal to their newborn pups. Livestock guardian dogs raise that instinctual protection to guard against intruding wolves, which are the biggest threat to their pups. And wolves don't know the difference between livestock guardian dogs and intruding wolves. They only know that there's a danger there. And so when wolves, knowing where wolves are denned with their pups is essential to help ensure that the livestock guardian dogs don't accidentally invade a den site and cause a fight. We don't want the dogs to fight at all. That's not their purpose. They're only supposed to be there as an early warning system to sound the alarm, and then that gives wolves a chance to depart once they know that the sheep are guarded, and for the herder to be more alert, be awake, and to reinforce the dog. As part of our project, we learned early on that having field crew members on the ground was essential, and especially ones that are bilingual because herders speak largely Spanish. We train the field crew members to work with the herders to make sure that they have the right equipment. Whoops, skipping ahead. To make sure they have the right equipment, things like flashlights, high-beam flashlights, and sound alarms, and we'll go into a few of those details too. And also to be monitoring the wolves. So they are essential for being able to check the field cameras, be documenting, scat, track, kill sites for where the wolves are, looking for den sites, learning as much as we can about the behavior and movement of those wolves. And that gets easier over time because we know the packs that are there, we know where they're going to den, and we're basically all kind of working together to make it work. And so we're also documenting everything that we do. So we have almost 20 years of data now that shows where wolves have overlapped frequently within a few miles of where the sheep are. It kind of happens continuously during the course of the grazing season, which we start in early June and run through the end of September into mid-October. And so we're documenting that wolves do come very close. Sometimes this is a picture of the same spot within 48 hours here of a wolf probably rolling in sheep dung. And so you can go back and tell everybody what, the unique smells. Wolves have amazing olfactory systems, and that's news to them. And then the sheep having been there and without having any types of losses there. Out of the 20,000 or so sheep that we have in our project area, typically in bands that are about 1,000 to 1,500 at a time, or less. And, we have them going off across about 1,200 square kilometers, close to over 700 square miles. It's pretty massive project area. And yet we're able to keep those losses of sheep to wolves in that project area down to under 5 sheep a year. And we've maintained that average for 19 years now. If we look at the sheep producers in the county next to us, where they are grazing fewer sheep, sometimes the same sheep, but they're not using the same methods that we're using to protect the wolves and protect the sheep, then we're seeing a dramatic loss there. Up to 10 times the amount of sheep are being killed. Wolves are being killed regularly there. Entire packs are being taken out. It's still a lot of loss happening. This is a map of southern Idaho or central Idaho, where most of our grazing takes place. Our highest concentration of grazing in that all those colors there in the central Idaho area, where that circle is, it says 4 is actually our project area. We have a higher concentration of sheep there on those public lands than anywhere else. They call it the sheep superhighway because of the intense density of sheep there. As you can see from the image, though, it's where the lowest loss is happening. And so over the 18 years, we've had typically around 20,000 sheep, less than 5 sheep a year killed by wolves. There's been no weight loss reported. We spend less than $5 a sheep, and we are paying for those costs to help protect the sheep, which the public has been supporting us with. The local community has been donating quite a bit to help continue this project. We've had continual.
Can I ask you a quick question here? There's
Sure.
2 wolves killed to mitigate. Why were those wolves killed?
That was over 18 years. And those 2 wolves were killed because there was one situation where we had a livestock guardian dog and I think there were 4 or 5 sheep that were killed. It was, I think part of it was that the producers at the time didn't really trust that the non-lethal measures would hold. And so that led to early on a couple of wolves being killed. But that was I guess it's been over 7 or 8 years now since we've lost any. Over the last 3 years, we've had 0 sheep losses in the project area, and yet we're still documenting continual wolf presence there as well. This is just kind of a summary of a paper that we're working on now. Our first 7 years we put into the Journal of Mammalogy, so there's a peer-reviewed paper. I'll send Mr. Reed a briefing that he can share with you guys as well, so you'll have those resources. But I think, stepping back, we're looking at that there's 2 really major pillars, maybe even 3, but for certain the 2, that these non-lethal adaptive tools are really effective at minimizing loss. But we pair those with USDA Wildlife Services on the ground, and they are the ones that are conducting the professional necropsy investigations. I think that's a really important standard to uphold, that having that rigorous investigation of what is actually causing mortality is important to the program. It's important for our data, but it's certainly probably even more so important to the producers, the agency, and the public to know, what are those causes there so that we can best address them.
Suzanne, can I interject? Is that Wildlife Services that does that work?
It is. In Idaho, it is. Yep.
Okay.
Some states have it a little differently, where there's both the state agency and Wildlife Services involved, but it tends in Idaho, it's been Wildlife Services.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. We've done first in field tests. We pioneered large scale deployment of turbo flattery, night corrals early on. We don't really use them anymore because all the other methods we're using are so much more, have been really effective. We keep the turbo flattery in our back pocket, but it's been years since we've had to use any of that. Right now, we're doing things more like the livestock guardian dogs are primarily go to, having good collars for them, mostly to prevent infighting among the dogs. The fox lights that I hand carried from Australia to Idaho many years ago, they've become the backbone for our use in making sure that the wolves know that human presence is around where the sheep are. And then we've also gone a decade without having private trapping and snaring in our project area on our public lands. And that's because of a model that was established by the county commissioners, working with the state legislators and with the Idaho Fish and Game Commission. If we saw recreational trapping and snaring in our project area, it would really destabilize our packs there, and it would be much harder to implement these methods than what we're seeing. We do lose some wolves from hunting seasons, but the trapping and snaring has been the most, yeah, I don't know how to phrase that, but the best in terms of eliminating wolves. That is the method that has worked the most effectively. And so, because we don't have the livestock loss concerns in our project area, the ranchers have helped stop the trapping and snaring, but also helped prevent aerial gunning of wolves by private individuals in our project area as well. And that leads me to the last point, which is the reciprocal tolerance that we have nurtured there. Coexistence is not just about society tolerating wolves, it's also about society tolerating agriculture and working lands traditions. And that's all part of the pillars that help support our project, because when all of our partners succeed, all the different sides succeed, that's a win for everyone. And we don't stop until we make sure that everyone is benefiting from the work that we're doing. This is just to give Glenn a moment to tease up his talk and to show you the animals that are living in our project area. These are all from our field cameras, and you can get a better sense of the landscape here as well. If you have any questions for me right now, this would be a good time for that as well.
Actually, I do. I mean, we obviously have, sheep in our district, so I'm in the northeast corner of Washington, but predominantly the livestock are cow-calf operations. And so in very densely forested areas. And we do use range riders, and the state has over succeeding years has paid for that. We have local NGOs that do that work. Just kind of curious how that, if you see a difference, like if your, the project that you've done looks at other types of livestock, to see what can potentially work between both, or if it's just something that's been for sheep.
It definitely has application across for both. What we've seen in Idaho long term is that more sheep are killed by wolves, more sheep are killed by everything than cattle, right? But a lot of the methods that we're using have been adopted, or we've taken them from cattle operations, for example, in Montana, that were working with wolves on the ground before we had them. So some do apply, and others, are more focused on the type of grazing that we're doing with the sheep production. But I'm happy to continue that conversation with you afterwards as well. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Glenn.
Okay. Suzanne, that was great, as usual. I've heard Suzanne's spiel many times. We've worked together, I don't know how many times it's been, Suzanne. We've just had these discussions and facilitated kind of a coexistence framework. So, with regard to your question, Senator Short, I am a cattle producer. I do have sheep as well, but we're public lands grazers. We've been doing this for 33 years on public lands. On the specific range that we're on right now, we've been at it for 20 years. We run, about 250 cow-calf pairs and then all their yearling cattle. So at any given time on the ranch, we have between 600 and 700 head of cattle on the ranch. We are public lands grazers, like I said, and right now our current ranges are, it's about 70 square miles, so 46,000 acres. Senator Short, pretty similar to the district you're talking about, northeastern Washington. We have a lot of timber, we have a lot of dense timber. We also have a huge elevational gradient that starts at about 4,800 feet, goes all the way up to nearly 10,000 feet. And 10,000 feet at our latitude happens to be alpine tundra. So you can see that, in that elevation gradient, there's just a vast scene of plant diversity and topography there. It's basically, steep mountainsides, deep canyons, high ridges, alpine peaks scattered throughout. So it's all contiguous, and unfortunate for us, it's fairly close to the largest contiguous block of wilderness in the lower 48, which is the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness Bitterroot Sailway Complex. And it just so happens that that was kind of the epicenter of the development of wolf populations in Idaho post reintroduction. We've always had wolves in Idaho. In fact, Suzanne and I just realized we were almost crossing paths many, many years ago because my wife and I were totally aware of a pack that was still existent right along the edge of the Frank Church near the Sawtooth Valley of Idaho. And so we've always had them, but it was a very low level. And that was why the Fish and Wildlife Service said, hey, we need to do a reintroduction here, or actually a reestablishment of a genetically supported population by numbers. So it was a reason they picked us and said, you have to do a recovery plan because you have wolves in the state right now. There were some up in the Panhandle. There were some in our location. And that was why we did a pretty aggressive reintroduction in response to Fish and Wildlife Services requirements to the state of Idaho. So it was in the early 90s, and Suzanne can probably speak to these dates better than me, but I think it was around 90, 93, 94 that wolves first were being reintroduced to Idaho, and they were Canadian wolves that were flown in. So we were ranching at the time, and I wondered if they were going to even affect us. I wasn't even sure. And I remember this one instance where I was fighting fire at the time on the side while ranching, and I just came off a fire, and I walked into the main warehouse in Salmon, Idaho, and there were these giant crates on the floor of the fire warehouse. And I was wearing my yellow web gear and Nomex. I was pretty dirty looking, and I walked up to the warehouse foreman, who's a friend of mine, and said, "Hey, what's with the crates? What's in there?" I was thinking it was some kind of new fire gear or something like that. And he said, "Those are wolves." And I said, "Wolves?" And he said, "Yeah, you know about the reintroduction and all this." And he said, they dropped them here. So I said, "Can I take a look?" And he said, "Oh yeah, go ahead." Because, we had a good relationship and he knew I wasn't going to do anything weird. So I walked up to this one crate and looked in there through the holes. There's like this grid on the front of it. And there was this word female on top of it. So apparently it was a female wolf. And I just went right up to that crate and looked at her eyes and I said, "Are you going to change my life forever?" And of course she didn't answer, but I knew what the answer was at that point in time, just looking at her, the size and scope of her form. I just realized that, yeah, our lives were going to be changed forever, as ranchers because we were ranching at the time. So, but it took quite a few years to gain momentum. And so, initially in the late 90s, early aughts, we started picking up a few wolf kills. And it wasn't until probably late aughts that we started to see a significant reduction, and it was only a few head at the beginning. And then come around, I think 2013, 2014. It was 2013, I remember now. Uh, as near as we could tell, we lost 14 head to wolf predation. And we were interacting with wolves all the time up on the range. And our neighbors were, picking up a lot of wolf kills. We had a pack move into our grazing allotment, and I don't know how many animals that was. There was no clear numbers at that time, but I'm guessing it was between 20 and 30 wolves. And we had a den that they dug in an aspen stand high up in some of our Forest Service allotment where a female denned and she had 8 pups in there. And that was a rumor. And I called the Idaho State Department of Fish and Game, and I knew who the wolf lead was for recovery in central Idaho. And I called him up. His name was Jason. And I said, "Jason, I think I got a pack of wolves on my grazing allotment." He said, "Oh yeah, you do, Glenn. We know all about them." And I said, "Why wouldn't you tell me this? Why, why, why do you get to play I got a secret with my livelihood. And so I was actually very angry about the situation. And I got to tell you, just flat out, I wasn't having any love for wolves at this point in my life because, we were losing cattle to wolves, and it's our income. It's kind of our entire business. There's no side business. Ranching isn't a side hustle. We started this business with 7 cows and no inherited equity, and everything for my wife and I was on the line. And, so I was pretty angry at Fish and Game. I was angry at the wolves. I was angry at Fish and Game. And he said, well, we were thinking about telling you, Glenn, but we didn't know what you'd do. And we just spent a whole bunch of money up there on that wolf den. And I said, what's that mean? He said, we just collared every pup up there. And at that point in time, Idaho and U.S. Fish and Wildlife had allowed ranchers to kill wolves, and it was even without predation. And he said, I got to tell you this just to be straight. This is the Idaho Fish and Game guy. He said, you are perfectly within your rights to kill every one of them. And I just said, that just doesn't resonate. That doesn't even make sense. That doesn't even make sense as an opportunity for me to correct the situation. Because here you spend all kinds of money, and what we're missing here, the biggest thing we're missing here on this whole wolf reintroduction is knowledge. It is the number one thing we're short on. And there's a huge vacancy in knowledge. And if we don't figure this thing out from a coexistence standpoint, right now, Fish and Wildlife Service has the rule of law over us. We have to have a functional population in Idaho. And how are we going to move forward if we just kill them all? And it just didn't make sense to me from, kind of a 30,000-foot view. On the ground, it really didn't make sense because, it was our livelihood. So, anyway, it was over the course of that summer that we decided to pull all of our cattle out. It was a great grass year, and we had enough grass at home, and hay was cheap. And I thought, you know what, we're going to just graze our place, and we're going to bring every one of those animals home. We run about 2,500 acres of pasture at home, and we put our entire cow herd on our home place, and we grazed our hay crop. And it costs a lot of money to feed them over the winter with hay we didn't raise, obviously. We had to buy it from our neighbors and whatnot. And the neighbors is one thing, but there's not a lot of organic hay. We're certified organic. We're one of the largest certified organic operations in the United States. It's hard to find organic hay. And I remember at that time we were really stressed out, and we were actually buying organic hay from Alberta because we exhausted all the local sources. So, that again put a pretty big hole in our pocket. We came back from the range that year, licking our wounds, wondering what we were going to do. And my wife and I were like, you know what? We're just going to sell the land associated with those grazing allotments and sell the land that validated those grazing allotments, the base properties, and we're going to get out of public lands grazing. And that's kind of where we were in December. We said we just can't put up with that kind of loss. We had wolves in our home place. Thankfully, we got some crazy paint horses that would actually attack wolves and run them off. So that worked pretty effectively. We also, at that time, were raising Great Pyrenees dogs. We had all these livestock guard dogs around. And so we weren't having wolf predation at home on our home place, but we were indeed having a lot of wolf predation up on the high ranges. So that year's wolf predation amount ended up being about $30,000 or $40,000. And that doesn't sound like a lot of money. On today's market, I can convert that by easily tenfold because cattle prices weren't that great at that time. And, we could easily say it was $250,000 to $300,000 worth of cow flesh that the wolves ate that year, if I converted it to today's valuation of cattle. So just to get that perspective of what that value was for us that time, $30,000 was just a ton of money. And it just wasn't, it was just sort of strictly a business decision. We're going to get out of this thing. Anyway, it was the weirdest thing because I was at a friend's house and we're down the valley. And we're actually Christmas caroling there. We've got a little band in our family, and we were Christmas caroling to some old ranchers down the road from us. And they have a whole bunch of Charles Marion Russell paintings on the wall. He's an old Western artist from Montana. And so he's a chronicler of the early American West in the early 1900s. And the one thing it's a consistent theme over many of his paintings is he's got cowboys living in cow camp on the range with their cattle. And we got into the pickup truck after singing at Roy and Jeannie's house, and I said, "Hey, Carol, what if we did that?" And she said, "Did what?" And I said, "What if we moved in with our cattle and we're a human presence on the range?" And we thought about it for a bit, and we called a friend of ours at the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy at that time was just beginning to do a easement process in our country, trying to lock up or preserve some of the habitat in these bottoms by partnering with ranchers with conservation easements that were pretty much development easements. So they were transitioning into this idea of being an environmental group, quote unquote, akin to like Earth First and the Wilderness Society, into something that ranchers were starting to see as a tool. So we called them in that context and said, "Hey, what if you partnered with us on a new way to graze the range? And you gave us $25,000 a year for 3 years to see if we can figure out together how to do this." And they absolutely went for it. And so they actually offset a lot of the cost initially for us to try to figure out this new paradigm, which actually is a paradigm it's like one of the oldest professions, right? Is herding and living with your cattle or sheep in wild country. So we did it. And we've been doing it ever since. And like in the introduction, we haven't lost any animals to wolves since that time, even though we've been coexisting with them. They're just outside of cow camp sometimes. We can hear them howling at night. We're running between 400 and 500 head of cattle up there every summer. We run a cow camp and we'll actually night pen those cattle at night near our cow camp. So we're moving this cow camp all over the place. We have about 10 or 12 camps a year. We don't repeat the same camps every year, but what we found with this is not only were our cattle thriving from not being eaten by wolves, but they also began to thrive in other ways too, because we were able to take them to the best grass. And we realized we were checking a lot of the boxes that they were in, since time immemorial, but as well in Montana. We're taking them to good grass, avoiding poisonous plants. We're being very discretionary about where they drink and how they drink. We're preventing any predation. We're preventing a lot of life loss because we were losing like 3% of our cattle every year before wolves, and now we weren't losing any. So the cash flow actually started to work because our cattle started gaining weight better under the new paradigm. Quick and dirty math says that we're picking up almost a pound a day on our weight gaining cattle, the yearling cattle we run up there. So, 1 pound a day on, say conservative $3 or $4, say it's a $4 market, which is today's market. That's $4 a head a day. And say you're running, 500 head of cattle up there, $4 a day. Well, that's $200,000. And it costs us about, for a 100-day grazing season, it costs us about, we figured now, with our increased size and crew, because of our increased size of cattle herd up there, we're running about $100,000 a year in costs just to keep those people up there, keep horses under them, keep them fed, keep the horses in good flesh and with shoes on their feet. So it is super costly. And that's why there's not a lot of people saying, "Oh, I'm going to do this." And it's because because a lot of people don't want to deal with the personnel issues. My wife and I both have a passion that we have to get a younger generation involved in ranching because most people in ranching today are, my age. They're 60 years old, and we're going to see this huge turnover to the next generation. And we both feel like if we don't invest in this generation now, ranching is going to be in trouble all across the West and even America. So, we have this higher calling about these young people that we employ, and we pay them well. Some are interns, but usually we hire those interns the second year. Like this year, we got 5 interns coming back from years past, and they're no longer interns, they're paid employees, and they're on payroll, and we pay them well. So they're now very engaged with not only thinking about wolf predation, but they're engaged with kind of rebuilding ecosystems up there, because what we found is we can really, really control our cattle completely with this methodology. And the exciting thing is we can turn like riparian conditions around. We can turn all ecosystems around. Now we have riparian conditions where beavers are rewilding themselves. They're just recolonizing our entire range because now we have really good control over cattle and we can get those ecosystem services because of that cattle control. So there's a whole realm of benefits that we're seeing from doing this besides just coexisting with wolves. And Suzanne, I think it was Suzanne asked me, we did a talk in Colorado together, and she said, well, or maybe it was somebody in the audience, do you think differently about wolves? Are wolves like this, this less hated coexistent companion up on these rangelands? And I will say this, that the wolves brought us to this place, to this new paradigm. They force an issue on us to try to recreate how we run on the range. And so I guess, I guess the terms I would use are mutual respect. Now we have a mutual respect for these wolves. And I think it's mutual because we see them coming down into our cow camp while we're gone with the cattle for the day. They're just kind of checking us out, and they spend a lot of time watching us. And now it's not this predator choice for them. So you might think, oh, this is still really costly, Glenn, and you still got to deal with the personnel issue. So there is a light of hope that we're going to experiment with this year. And I think that this is going to dramatically change our labor pool. We're working with the Western Landowners Alliance, the BLM, the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the state ag department and Department of Lands. And we're actually going to put collars on these cattle. And you've probably heard of these collars. These collars are basically, you can control your cattle and keep them in with these collars. These collars will be satellite based, so we know where all of our cattle are. We can see where they are on our phone, and we can move and manage them according to, their current location. So we can create a polygon basically that is basically like a no fence boundary that people have been using for their yard dogs for a while, but now we're using the same technology for cattle. And so the exciting thing about that is we can still herd and polygon grades using these collars, but now we can do it with way, way less people. We're talking about, maybe a quarter of the people. Some people are saying, oh, we can actually handle the wolf issue with these collars, and that's going to take care of it. But obviously, wolves don't really care whether an animal has collars or not. They still see beefsteak walking by, right? So the collars really aren't going to change any predation issues. But for us, the collars are going to change the people issue because we believe that we have to have people up on the ground, no matter what. With wolf predation, we have to have people on the ground. But what we realized, even with the collars, is it's going to take us to a place where we have to be very intentional now, because when we were herding the cattle before without the use of collars and intentionally taking them and keeping track of them all across the landscape, we de facto dealt with issues like access to water. We kept them out of poisonous plant populations like tall larkspur and short larkspur. We kept them away from death camas populations. These are all poisonous plants. We kept them away from topography issues where they're going to fall off cliffs and get hurt or something like that. So we're intentionally thinking about all that while we're riding and herding up there with our teams. But what we realize is, okay, we're going to put these collars on. It's not set it and forget it. We still needed a human presence on the land to continue for those care aspects of our cattle, the caretaking aspects of our cattle, and keeping them alive, keeping them out of poisonous plants, and keeping a human presence there because of wolves. Because without the human presence, we're going to fail again, because again, these wolves will eat collared animals. But the other part of it is, that we're going to still have to herd those cattle back into a night pen at the end of the day because of nighttime wolf predation. So there's still people involved, but the amount of people is going to be way less. And we're still going to be able to check all those boxes of weight gain, improved weight gain, um, being able to locate and find all of our cattle in case of wildfire, dealing with the wolf issue. So all those boxes are still going to be checked with way, way less people. So I actually think that technology people used to say, "Oh, technology is going to answer everything," and we got very cynical about it, especially people like my age. But on the other hand, this technology I think has great hope, and I'm talking to a lot of people across the West who are using these collars right now, and I don't think I'm thinking wrong about the technology. I think it's going to be kind of a golden ticket to control our cattle, but in the context of that control, if we incorporate a human presence with that, I don't think we're going to have a problem with coexistence with wolves. I think it's actually going to be, as it is now in a lot of Idaho, it's not really passe coexistence of wolves. It's still something you have to be very intentional about and thinking about. But now, for my neighbors who aren't using some of these methodologies that we are, they all agree that wolves are here to stay. And, so whatever they can incur as part of their operation to ensure that their cattle have longevity in that situation. They're going to do. So I think we're going to see some slow movement of very conventional cattle operations into these methodologies to just keep their cattle alive, especially in today's price climate. So, and they'll use collars and they'll use people to do it. And it kind of fits in very closely with what Suzanne's talking about as far as, coexistence is possible. And I don't I don't feel overwhelmed and burdened by it like I used to. Now it's just kind of a fact of life, and it's one of our costs of operation. But we're going to win on other fronts. So it isn't only this sacrificial thing that we got to say, oh, we're going to sacrifice these qualities of our operation to allow wolf coexistence. Rather, I think we're going to win on other fronts. I think we're going to win on feed quality. I think those cattle are going to gain weight better. I think we're going to see less stress in cattle. I've talked to friends in Colorado with this new wolf reintroduction there, and some are dealing with a lot of stress. Others are not. And when I come to find out the way they handle their cattle and their operation, we're starting to see some parallels between real effective low stress stockmanship with a drop in wolf predation. And I think it's just because wolves can sense from a distance, whether by smell or other cues that we don't know about, when cattle are stressed. And as a result, they're more apt to be predators in those situations. So I think the collars are actually going to reduce stress as well in these cattle. And, it's going to be kind of a de facto stockmanship tool. And when we have de facto stockmanship or intentional stockmanship, we have lower stress in our cattle. And I think when we have that, we have lower predation as well. And I think that kind of about covers it. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I covered a lot of ground really fast. Um, but that's kind of the gist of what we're doing. And right now, I think it's working. Pretty optimistic. And if you want to call me again at the end of the season and see how these collars worked, I'd love to share that information with you all, because I do think that there's a lot of potential there. And the collars are just one cog in the wheel of how we get to think about these wolves. So there's a lot of tools. Suzanne is talking about fladry. We don't use fladry anymore. We use hot wire around our night grounds. And I know some cattle folks who are using fox lights to great effect. So there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, and there's all kinds of different things we can do. But I think this can work.
And
Anyway,
thank you so much. This is just perfect. And so glad that you didn't have having to deal with today or something that would have kept you from joining us. So, but with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Ron. I know we've got some folks that have questions and
Good.
Well, thank you, Glenn. That was a wonderful bit of information there. A lot of that was very new to me and very, very interesting. And Suzanne, thank you so much. And Representative Reeves, thank you so much for helping us put this together. I guess we can open it up. We've got some time left, so we can open it up to some questions if anyone has any.
One of the questions that occurred to me, Suzanne, when you were describing um, the behavior of wolves and how they are territorial, you mentioned that in the event a pack is eliminated, that it's only a matter of time until the youngsters from the neighboring pack move in and set up camp. Is that a year, 2, 3? I'm sure there's no set time, but the reason I ask a timing question there is, while it makes logical sense that a void will be filled, depending on the time it takes to fill it, it may save a rancher's livelihood who's running not 2,500 head of cattle, but maybe 30. So there's an issue of scale here that is escaping me.
so what we've seen is that it typically happens in under 2 years. I think that was the last peer-reviewed documentation of that. The problem is if you look at our neighbors here that were for the Wood River Wolf Project, you look at the next county, is that they're losing normally 10 times the amount of sheep that what we're losing. And it's over that long term. So when you're dealing with constant loss, constant stress on your operation, and because they're not using the same methods that we are, it is, I think it shows that just eliminating wolves doesn't solve the problem unless you're eliminating all of them, unless you're just saying that, you're going to just get rid of wolves, period, from that region of the state. But if you look at the outcome of using these adaptive measures and ensuring that the wolf packs stay intact, it's actually better for the livestock to have the intact wolf packs than it is to have wolves eliminated.
It's also well documented through peer-reviewed science that when wolves are removed from a pack, it doesn't destabilize the pack, and it can also increase depredations. Taking the whole pack out is one thing, but often it's not what happens. They usually will take one or two, and that destabilizes the pack. It breaks up the family structure, and it's really well documented that it increases predation often. So
It can, yeah, it can.
Yeah.
Especially when you're leaving the pups behind and they're teenagers. So
Yeah.
they're the most likely to not be able to figure it out on their own. Wolves tend to not have really good hunting skills until they're about 10 months of age. Typically, that's about the time that they can actually hunt on their own. So it's all about the dynamics of that family.
So kind of question in that regard, have you been in a situation during the time that you've done this project to encounter a pack that's a very habitual, offending pack? And if so, how were you able to handle that, or how was the project able to handle that?
I've not only worked on this project, I've worked in ranches kind of across the Western United States, and now also in Israel and Europe and stuff. And just from observation, I'm not sure that there's anything in the peer-reviewed research, but what I've seen is that packs don't start off as habitually offending packs. What happens is that they're taught to eat livestock. And there's some kind of events that occur, whether it's the attractants, if you go like the first depredations that have happened in Oregon happened on a sheep ranch where they were they were lambing right next to where the county folks had been dumping dead livestock. And it drew in wolves from over 10 miles away that were youngsters that weren't doing so well on their own. So they came, wolves' superpowers, their nose, their olfactory system is amazing, and they're scavengers as well as predators. So when you draw them in like that, the wolves arrived, they saw these tons of old maggoty livestock, and then they saw the spring lambs on the other side of the fence. So they hopped the fence and started killing spring lambs. Kind of the same thing you and I would do, right? If we were given that same situation. And so it's knowing how to intercede to prevent that from happening to start off with, rather than teaching the wolves to prey on livestock. And it really is a matter of just being ahead of them.
Yep. Yep.
Prevention is everything.
Sure. Glenn, one of the things, especially with similarity, I mean, obviously not the height on the mountains that you have, in Idaho, but, generally our cow-calf operations, I mean, they too are on public grazing allotments with the Forest Service generally. And, I think about your ability to pull the cattle in at night. Is that just in those areas where you have meadows? Do you do the same thing if they're grazing in the mountains, in and amongst trees? You're still pulling in those livestock every night?
That's a great question, Senator Short. And at first, we didn't know what we were going to do. We just kind of invented this as we went. So it works. It worked everywhere. So even on these high alpine areas, where we had a lot of thick timber, as long as there was adequate graze up there, I mean, obviously, you're going to put cattle up there. They're grazers. And you got to ensure that there's adequate feed up there. So, those black pieces of timber, say dense lodgepole pine forest, they almost have nothing on the ground underneath them. So, of course, they're not going to work out, but all that fingered Douglas fir and ponderosa pine timber, it's got a lot of grass in it. And so we would actually put our cow camp and our night grounds right in the middle of a lot of those forests. And so, on a given night ground, it might be a 1 acre night ground. We use a little bigger night grounds when we're running cow-calf pairs so nobody gets trampled. So that might be a 2 acre night ground with a hot wire. We're good at laying out temporary hot wire fences, just fiberglass posts and this stuff called polytwine. It's
Mhm.
really easy to use. So we'll put that up on, say, a 2 acre piece, and in that enclosure for the night, there's say 400 head of cattle, 500 head of cattle, somewhere in there. And there's maybe, 30, 40 trees in there as well, or even more. So they're right in the middle of a forest situation.
Mhm.
But there's so much training on this thing. We're kind of amazed that we didn't think it would work, but within 2 weeks, the herd was pretty trained to, they were really conditioned to go back to camp and go back to that night ground. And they're very habitual, but they're very diurnal. They like to start at,
Mhm.
we're catching horses at 4:30 in the morning with headlamps. It's dark, so we're grabbing those horses, get saddled up just as light comes. The second light comes, those diurnal cattle, they're ready to rise and eat.
Mhm.
But we come back at, say, 10:30 at night, and we drop them in that night ground, and boy, they lay down immediately. So that takes about 2 weeks. And then for the rest of the summer, they're pretty habitual on that. And so you can stick them anywhere, as long as we try to give them a place to lay down, so we won't put them on a steep mountainside. We'll try to find a little bench or something like that. You just got to be common sense about that stuff. So, but cattle are, and these are not, they are wild cattle. Like, I don't even let my crew tag them, tag babies, when they're born. I don't let them tag calves because people always are getting hurt because these cows are very aggressive cows. But on horseback, when you're up there, boy, you can really train them with stockmanship. And we actually like them a little wild because actually they're very responsive to pressure and release. And we actually kind of build a relationship, in a week or two with that stockmanship that they really respect what we're trying to do. I don't know, if they're cognizant about the wolf thing at all, but they do respect our method. And I would say, somebody with crazy cattle or something like that, I would say, I could train them. I don't feel intimidated by any amount of wild anymore on cattle.
Hey, Glenn,
So, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I, yeah, I got a question for you.
Yes.
You've adapted your ranch. Is there anything government can do to make it easier for other ranchers to adapt how they do their ranching?
That's a really good question. For the government is kind of a wild ride, in terms of agency personnel, and it's partly because you have these partisan politics trickle down. You get a new administration in, and then you get a dynamic change in administration. So, you have this trickle down kind of overall vision of public lands management. So it can be a really, really wild ride. So, um, when we started this thing, they just had no idea what we're doing. The Forest Service didn't. And I just kept inviting him. I said, "Hey, we're trying some different things up here. Will you come with us?" And so I finally got a district ranger up there on horseback and his crew. He was, the guy who was the head of the whole ranger district. And anyway, we got up there, and I remember when he first spotted one of these night grounds. Um, he said, "What happened here?" And so we rode through it. And I explained to him what was happening. And then we took him to the one the year before and the year before that. And he was silent for a while. I was wondering if we were going to be in trouble. But he said, "You know what? You're getting vegetative response by the impact of those night grounds that we didn't even think about. And it's good. It's a good response." And, at the end of the day, I was riding in a pickup back to the valley with him. And he said, "I'm not supposed to say this as a district ranger, but," he said, "Glenn, I don't care how many cattle you run. I don't even care. Just don't even tell me. Just don't even tell me what you're doing. But what you're doing for that range up there is game changing. And we need to think about how we can incorporate it into public lands management all across the West." So, but the cool thing is, Representative, that it's really exciting because I'm starting now to see that in the agencies. I'm starting to see agencies, especially after this incredible downsizing in both Forest and BLM. It seems like the last men and women standing are pretty engaged in what they're doing on public lands. Um, and I'm not going to go partisan on you and say it's good or bad or ugly or whatever. It is just what it is. Here we are at this way, way lower population of government employees, like our local Forest Service, the Salmon Chalice National Forest, the main forest in central Idaho, is down 75% in staffing. The BLM right now is down about 40%, but I think we're going to get to 65 because right now Burgum just put another initiative out there to reduce force even more. So the reality is that I think we're seeing a huge phase change, a sea change in that population that is Forest Service and BLM employees. And I'm seeing this new level of engagement about what's going on the land. And like the Forest Service just on their own initiative this year, just 2 months ago, wrote basically a whole contract that is now an MOU between us and them that talks about these practices and now has put it on paper where the ranger actually is now signing that. And so that's exactly the kind of continuance that we were looking for because we just wanted support from the land managers that we were doing this thing, because it's completely different from what conventional management has been. Because we were conventionally practicing before the wolves came, the way everybody else does. Open a gate basically in the spring, turn the cattle out, move them to a new pasture when we're supposed to, and then bring them home in November. That's what we're doing every year. And the wolves kind of force the issue and ask, offered a chance for us to change completely how we do it. And now the Forest Service and BLM are both seeing transformative land change in terms of like ecosystems up there because now we can control our cattle. So they're on board. So I'm excited about that. You know, it's not formalized yet, but I'm starting to see the possibility of what can happen on public lands because of what we're doing.
No, I appreciate that. I think one of the things, obviously you did a wholesale change to your operation, and you talk about the investment, what the cost has been, and all of that, and you've got the collars, which I think are going to be tried here in Washington too.
But they are.
But was there NGO help with that, or state budget help, or anything, realizing they're the state's wildlife population, there's a benefit to the public? Or did you guys just shoulder the whole thing on your own?
So initially, you know, it was Nature Conservancy. That was the NGO that partnered
Okay.
with us.
Okay.
So really no government support for that. You know, I just don't think they have it in their regulatory position to be able to support those kind of things. But so there is more NGO support in terms of, and one is actually a government agency. It's the state of Idaho. State of Idaho is actually getting really on board with what's going on, even though they're a little broke right now. But they are actually facilitating relationships with other NGOs in and around Idaho to try to get some more funding funneled toward the process like this. So that's actually how we got on board with the collars. The BLM and TNC were working together on trying to figure out a way for us to get collars up here. And it was Western Landowners Alliance and the state of Idaho facilitating that relationship. So it was actually, in the end, TNC wrote the check for the collars for this year. Next year, it's going to be others who write the check for the collars for year 2 and 3. And I think you have the same opportunity in Washington to work with like a WLA to try to, you know, innovate and come up with these, you know, coexistence approaches, you know, with regard to wolves, but also regard to the whole ecosystem. So there's money out there, and I think it's an exciting time. These collars are dang expensive, but after, you know, interviewing people who've been using them for 3 years, they're now ready to shoulder the cost of the collars out of their own pocket because they're seeing a transformative force that's changed their labor picture. It's changed their stockmanship picture. It's changed the wellness of their cattle. They're not losing cattle anymore. So, you know, so I think that, you know, we're seeing a sea change in how we handle cattle, especially in the wide open spaces of the West. You know, I think 5 to 10 years, we're going to see over 50% of grazing land permittees using these collars. And there's money out there right now. You know, and in fact, I was talking to the representative from the collar manufacturer. The one I'm using is Halter. And I said, Andy, hey, we're running a prototype here. Um, you know, we're trying to do these ecosystem things and provide these services with our collars as well. I said, can you put us on a pilot program? He said, no, we're not going to do that. But he said, there's tons of partners. You just start working the woodwork. There's money out there. And I'm confident, you know, in Washington, you're going to see the same thing. You know, I actually know the state director of TNC for Washington. Mike Stevens would be so into this. He would be so into this idea. And I think you could get traction with that NGO as well as Western landowners. And, you know, it might be even TU, Trout Unlimited, might be interested in these collars because Trout Unlimited could conceptually say, oh my gosh, we could actually protect trout habitat in this critical stream, you know, with this state sensitive species by using collars to keep cows out of this creek, you know. So there's the potential partners is pretty endless. And you know, I think the climate is kind of ready for that, you know. And it's not only about wolves anymore for us, it's about all this habitat. And there's a lot of stakeholders who are interested in taking care of that.
Well,
Yeah, I
thank you
would
so much.
just add from the sheep perspective, that we've invested well over $1 million in this program over the last 18 years, and that's private donations and funding and stuff that we've had to
Yes.
tiny bit of government support, but it's been pretty small. But the state of Idaho spends over $1 million a year killing wolves. So we don't see the investment in the non-lethal that we're seeing from this, from the state. The only funding that we tend to get has been from the federal government, and that's been sparse. Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully we'll get, some more support along the way. But the more that the state can get engaged in helping support these programs from the get-go, I think, it's money well spent. And we've certainly saved far more in the amount of livestock that we've saved than the amount of money that the state has saved in
Yes.
having to use aerial gunning and putting trappers and stuff out there. So that the cost benefit is, there's no doubt that we're saving on both ends there. Yeah, and I know we're going over time, so Senator Short, thank you so much for this, and Ron, we really appreciate.
Thank you all thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Senator Short and Representative Keaton, and I'm not sure if Senator or Representative Richards and Representative Engel and everyone else. I really appreciate it, and I hope it was as informational and positive for all of you as it was for me.
Thank
So
you.
thank you all very much. Thank you again, Suzanne. Thank you,
Take care,
Representative.
you guys.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks for
And we're happy to
facilitating.
come back anytime.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
will. We'll be back.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bring some ranchers with you next time, Ron. I'd love
We
to
want
answer
to.
their
We
questions.
loved your presentation very
Good deal.
much.
Cool.
Excellent.
All right,
Thanks.
thanks.
Thanks so much.
Take care, guys.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.